Hello everyone, thanks for listening to my presentation. My name is Francisco Ascui and I'm going to talk about operationalizing natural capital credit risk assessment in agricultural production. Over the next 10 minutes I want to answer these 4 questions. What is natural capital credit risk assessment? Why is it important in agriculture in particular? What is needed to operationalize it? And how practicable is this? First of all, let's define some terms. Natural capital is the stock of the world's renewable and non-renewable natural resources and ecosystems. Things like minerals, soil, water and biodiversity that yield flows of environmental goods and services which directly and indirectly underpin the global economy and human well-being. Credit risk is the risk of economic loss from the failure of a counterparty to fulfill its contractual obligations. For example, from a bank's perspective, the risk that someone won't pay back a loan. Putting these together, natural capital credit risk assessment, or NCRA, is the process of assessing credit risk arising from impacts or dependencies on natural capital. Now, I just want to briefly explain the difference between natural capital thinking and earlier environmental thinking in business and how this translates into a difference in perspective for the financial sector as the providers of capital to businesses. From the 1990s, banks lending to industry started to realize that some borrowers could have impacts on the environment that could create risks for the lender. For example, if the bank held land as collateral that turned out to be contaminated, they could face a liability for clean-up costs under new legislation that was passed in many countries at around that time. They also realized that they could suffer reputational damage from lending to particularly contentious projects. This led to the development of environmental credit risk assessment, or ECRA, as a way of assessing the risks associated with the environmental impacts of a borrower. Over the last 8 years, the idea of the environment as natural capital has become very popular. The main difference with natural capital thinking is that it explicitly recognizes not just impacts on the environment, but also dependencies. So for example, a coal-fired power plant depends on water for cooling and stocks of coal for fuel. Natural capital dependencies can be threatened by a variety of environmental or social changes, thus giving rise to a new set of risks that translate into credit risk for a lender. Natural capital credit risk assessment is a new approach that expands the scope of ECRA to include dependency risks. One important clarification: natural capital credit risk assessment is not the same as natural capital accounting. Natural capital accounting is generally a backward-looking process that quantifies the state of natural assets within a specified boundary, such as a country or a land area. Natural capital risk assessment is forward-looking and can include any process that affects the natural capital assets that an entity impacts on or depends on. The two activities are therefore distinct but should be seen as complementary. So why is natural capital credit risk assessment important for the agricultural sector in particular? Well, because agriculture is a major source of impacts on natural capital globally. For example, cereal crops and livestock production together have been estimated to cause about $2.3 trillion in natural capital costs, or 150% of their economic value. Agriculture is also the most exposed sector in terms of material dependency risks, as shown in the diagram there. The sector also needs significant investment in order to achieve a 50% increase in production to feed 9 billion people by 2050. And around the world, 90% of all farms are family-owned, and often bank lending is the main source of finance for new investment after the owner's retained earnings. Putting all of that together means that if banks can take natural capital risk into account in their lending decisions, this could have a significant impact on the future trajectory of agricultural systems in terms of both reducing their impacts and improving resilience. So what is needed to operationalize natural capital credit risk assessment? First of all, we need leaders who are willing to pioneer new approaches to assessing natural capital risk. There are willing leaders, such as the organizations behind the Natural Capital Finance Alliance. but the research community has an important role to play in helping to support them in solving the remaining challenges quickly before that organisational willingness runs out of steam. Secondly, we need a common standardised approach. This is now in place. Last year, the Natural Capital Finance Alliance published a guide to natural capital credit risk assessment in agriculture based on the Natural Capital Protocol. Thirdly, we need an understanding of what risks are material for specific subsectors and geographies. This is vital because risk is context dependent, and the agriculture sector unfortunately exhibits a high degree of heterogeneity of natural capital impacts and dependencies across activities and locations, making it unlike the energy sector, for example. A knowledge base on this is developing, and I'm going to present some results for several sectors of Australian agriculture in a moment. Finally, we need practicable risk indicators and sources of data to populate those indicators in order to assess material risks. This is where I think the biggest challenge is. Here are 3 examples of natural capital risk materiality assessments for sectors of Australian agriculture: wheat, beef and sheep production, which together account for 44% of the value of Australian agriculture. These assessments only cover natural capital dependencies, not impacts. So you have to interpret a risk area like energy as meaning the risks associated with dependency on energy resources, as opposed to the impacts arising from energy use. As you can see, wheat looks rather different to the 2 livestock sectors, which are essentially identical, the only difference between them being that sheep in Australia are a bit more susceptible to temperature extremes, such as cold snaps at lambing and after shearing. There are also common issues across all 3 sectors, such as water availability, extreme weather, and weeds, pests and diseases, all of which are linked by climate change as a factor that will likely exacerbate them in future. And there are a few risks which are only applicable in certain contexts, such as animal welfare and pasture composition being issues for livestock farming, which aren't applicable to wheat cropping in Australia. Now, if you're familiar with any of these sectors in other countries, you may well notice some differences. So, for example, intensive beef production in feedlots would have a different risk profile to what I've shown here, which is primarily for extensively grazed beef cattle. So I hope that brief overview illustrates why a subsector and geography-specific approach is required. I hope it also shows that it's possible to distill down the many hundreds of possible natural capital impact and dependency risks to a manageable few that could feasibly be taken into account in a credit risk assessment. Turning now to risk indicators and data sources. This slide summarizes some recent work that I've done with colleagues at the University of New England, assessing the practicability of different indicators for the sheep sector. The blue line shows the practicability of the indicators and data against the orange line, which is the materiality of the risks. This shows that although we don't have perfect indicators to measure any natural capital dependency risks, we do have at least moderately practicable indicators and data for all of the moderately or highly material risk areas. There is an irreducible element of subjectivity in this. Until we start measuring these indicators consistently at scale and over time, and are then able to compare with similarly consistent measures of farm productivity and profitability, we have to rely on qualitative assessments, in this case using expert elicitation. The good news is that with minor variations, these same indicators and data sources are also applicable to the beef sector and to the subset of risks that are shared in common with the wheat sector. So, for example, we can use the same sources of meteorological data in Australia provided by the Bureau of Meteorology to calculate a variability-adjusted precipitation index for all 3 sectors. But they would be slightly different. So the wheat indicator might focus on precipitation over the early growing period, whereas the livestock indicators would need to be normalized against the stocking rate. More sophisticated integrated models could also be used in all three cases. Risks associated with dependency on biodiversity stand out as being challenging to measure, although fortunately none of these three subsectors are highly dependent on services provided by biodiversity like pollination. It should also be noted that these results only show the most practicable indicators within each risk area. So for example, within soil quality, ground cover is considered to be a fairly reliable indicator of soil erosion risk, for which there's good data available from remote sensing. But soil erosion is just one aspect of soil quality risk. Other threats like acidification, salinity, and loss of soil organic carbon are also highly material in Australia, but suitable indicators are more challenging to define and data is less widely available. Then there are other aspects of soil quality like its biological condition, for which it's extremely difficult even to define suitable indicators, let alone find practicable data. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the complexity of agricultural systems and to conclude that risk assessment is impractical. However, we have to remember that decisions still have to be made despite complexity and uncertainty. Every lender faced with a loan application from a borrower is presented with irreducible uncertainty about the borrower's ability to repay the loan in future, but they still have to make a decision. We can't expect perfect measures of risk. All we need is something better than the current approach, which takes minimal notice of natural capital risk. Even moderately appropriate indicators and data could help improve a lender's ability to predict adverse outcomes, which in turn enables them to intervene in a variety of ways. It's not just about saying yes or no to an application of credit. Identifying risks early in the process can enable a bank to help farmers manage those risks better, thus improving the farmer's financial position and the condition of their natural capital, which ultimately benefits all of us. In summary, I hope I've explained what natural capital credit risk assessment is and why it's important. In order to operationalize it, we need willing pioneers and a standardized approach, both of which are now in place, and a good understanding of the most material risks for specific subsectors and geographies, which is emerging. We also need practicable indicators and sources of data to populate those indicators. I don't want to underestimate the scale of this challenge, but my work has shown that at least in what is possibly a best case scenario in terms of Australian broadacre cropping and livestock production, there are at least moderately practicable indicators and data to assess all of the major material risks. So I think that we can conclude that it is indeed possible to operationalize natural capital credit risk assessment. And in future, a bank's credit officer could feasibly have two types of information in front of them: a set of financial accounts and a set of natural capital risk indicators. This isn't far-fetched science fiction. The screenshot on the right is from a service provider who's already providing this sort of information to Australian banks. There are, of course, still many challenges to resolve with further research. I'll mention just 4 areas which I think need further work. One is expanding this work to other subsectors and geographies. Another is identifying suitable risk thresholds, or the point at which a risk moves to a higher risk rating. Quantifying the links between financial performance and these indicators, and investigating interactions between risk factors and ways of aggregating risks together. My contact details are below if you have any questions, and I've added some references to the final slide. Thanks again for listening.